We'd been married 9 years, long enough for love to lose its edge. Somewhere between shared breakfasts and quiet nights, it softened. Not gone, just quieter, like music drifting from another room. I told myself that's how real marriages age. Comfort over passion. Stability over sparks. The kind of love that doesn't need constant proving. Mornings smelled like coffee and his cologne. He liked it black, no sugar. I'd wake a few minutes before him just to watch him stir awake. The slow rub of his eyes, the low sigh before stepping into another day. Peace lived in those tiny rituals. The kind that fools you into thinking everything's fine just because it's familiar. We had our rhythm. Unspoken vows tucked inside daily habits. He'd read the news at the kitchen table, glasses slipping halfway down his nose. I'd water the plants by the window, counting leaves like it meant something. The city outside hummed, and we moved through it, side by side, not touching. Still together, but not quite connected. Love changes. Everyone says that. Less fire, more warmth. I didn't notice when warmth started cooling into something else. It began quietly. They always do. He stopped calling during lunch. Stopped asking about my day. Stopped looking up when I spoke. Small things, easy to ignore. Easy to explain away. I filled the silence. Talked about a friend's baby. A book. Work. He nodded. Smiled sometimes. A polite, distracted smile, the kind that hides the truth. Peace has a way of hiding storms beneath it, at night. He turned away from me, used to pull me close. Now he moved carefully, as if my skin might burn. The bed felt bigger. The silence is heavier. I told myself it was stress, work, fatigue, anything but what it was. After all, we weren't fighting. We weren't breaking. Just drifting. But love doesn't disappear that quietly. One evening, while folding laundry, I noticed how few of his shirts were there. I hadn't realized how often he was gone. Late meetings, overnight trips. It's kind of absences that sound normal when you say them out loud. I trusted him. Or maybe I trusted the idea of us more than him. We still looked fine from the outside. Dinner once a week. A shared laugh in the car. But underneath something hollow. Like the echo after the music stops. There's one night I can't forget. A friend's anniversary party. Champagne, music, polite laughter. He smiled that perfect husband smile, hand at the small of my back. We looked right together. People saw what they wanted to see. But I felt it. I was standing next to a stranger wearing my husband's face. On the drive home, city lights flickered across his profile, calm, detached, peaceful, even. I envied that peace. Because sometimes peace isn't happiness. It's detachment in disguise. Sometimes love doesn't end with anger. It ends with indifference. That night I couldn't sleep. The rain kept time against the window. Soft, steady, repetitive. Like us. Like everything that used to mean something. I wondered when routine had turned into erosion. The next morning, nothing changed. He kissed my forehead before leaving, same as always. Habit disguised as affection. I stood by the door, staring at the space where his shoes had been. Felt something twist inside. Unease, maybe. Or intuition. The kind of whisper you pretend not to hear. I ignored it. Weeks blurred together. Work, errands, dinner for one. He became quieter, more careful with his time. I stopped asking questions. Silence was easier. Then one afternoon I reached into his coat pocket. Just muscle memory checking before hanging it up. My fingers brushed something cold. Metal. A hotel key card. At first, it didn't register. Maybe a business trip. Maybe he forgot to tell me. But then I saw the hotel name. Not a place we'd ever stayed. Suite 412. That number sat heavily in my palm. And just like that, everything went still. Not panic. Not anger, stillness. Like the moment right before a storm when the air forgets to breathe. The truth doesn't scream. It whispers. And once you hear it, you can't unhear it. I slipped the card back into his coat pocket. Waited for him to come home. Cooked dinner. Asked about his day, smiled when he said he'd be working late tomorrow. That night, he fell asleep easily. I didn't. I lay beside him, eyes open, his heart calm most strangely. I'd made a decision. Tomorrow I'd find that room, and when I did, he'd never forget it. Morning came like any other, pale light spilling through the curtains, the soft clatter of dishes, the muted rhythm of routine pretending everything was fine. But something inside me had shifted. I moved through our kitchen as if I were playing a part I no longer believed in. He came downstairs, adjusting his tie, his expression half distracted, half charming, the version of him that once made me fall in love. He smiled faintly when he saw me. I smiled back. That was our dance now, polite, practiced. Empty. He kissed my cheek before leaving for work, the scent of his cologne lingering a little too long. I waited by the door until his car disappeared down the street. Then I went upstairs, opened the wardrobe, and pulled out the coat. The hotel key was still there. I held it between my fingers, studying the small, unremarkable rectangle of plastic, something so ordinary, yet heavy enough to tilt the ground beneath my feet. It wasn't the key itself that hurt. It was the story it hinted at. Life is happening somewhere else beyond the edges of mine. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just stood there feeling something colder, detachment wrapped in clarity. Because when love begins to rot, it doesn't do it loudly. It seeps in quietly until one day, even the lies sound like truth. Hook, it's strange how betrayal looks so harmless before it's named. I spent that morning pretending to work from home, my laptop open, but my mind elsewhere. I searched the hotel name, the Mirabelle Suites, mid-range, quiet, tucked in the city's business district. The kind of place meant for short stays and shorter secrets. I called the front desk under the pretense of confirming a reservation my husband might have made. My voice didn't shake. The receptionist cheerfully told me there was a booking for his name that weekend. 2 nights. One suite. Suite 412. I thanked her, hung up, and stared at the wall. My world didn't fall apart. It simply folded in on itself. I wanted to believe there was an explanation, maybe a client meeting, maybe a surprise. But even as I thought it, the words sounded ridiculous. People who love you don't hide hotel keys. They don't create spaces you're never invited into. By noon. I'd made up my mind. I would go there first. I waited until the next day, Friday. He left the house in the same rhythm as always. Same kiss, same words, same lie. I gave him my usual smile and watched his car fade into traffic. I packed a small bag. Nothing obvious, just a notebook, a change of clothes, a quiet resolve. I wore a black dress, the kind that didn't draw attention but still felt like armor. The city felt different that day. Every streetlight, every passing stranger seemed part of some silent play I was walking through. I parked 2 blocks away from the hotel and walked the rest of the distance, my heels tapping a measured rhythm that steadied my pulse. The Mirabelle Suites looked ordinary glass front. Beige walls, polite staff in crisp uniforms. I could have been anyone walking through those doors. I approached the front desk and smiled. "Hi, I'm here to check in for my husband. He's running late, but the reservation should be under Daniel Hale." The receptionist glanced at the screen, nodded, and handed me the key card. Suite 412. For a moment, I just held it. The same card. The same number. Now, officially mine. I thanked her and took the elevator. The ride was slow, humming, reflective. I watched the floors blink by, 2, 3. For my heart didn't race, it slowed. When I reached the door, I paused. The hallway was silent except for the faint hum of air conditioning. I slid the card in. The light turned green. The lock clicked open. The suite smelled faintly of roses and perfume. Not mine. Everything was perfectly arranged. Champagne on ice. 2 glasses, a folded note on the table that read, "Can't wait to see you again." I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. The air already told the story. I walked slowly through the room, 1 step, then another, studying every detail as if I were cataloging evidence from someone else's life. The curtains were drawn halfway, the bed neatly made, Soft music playing low from a Bluetooth speaker. The kind of atmosphere designed for affection, except none of it was meant for me. I sat on the edge of the bed and let the silence settle. Beneath the hurt, there was something else, a strange stillness that felt like truth. This was what he'd chosen. This was where he felt alive while I watered the plants and waited for him to come home. Hook. Some betrayals don't scream in your face, they whisper in perfume and champagne. I spent the afternoon there, not moving much, just existing in the space he'd made for lies. I opened the blinds. Sunlight filled the room, harsh, unforgiving, real. I looked at my reflection in the window. My face was calm, but my eyes were different. Older. Maybe wiser. It struck me then that betrayal doesn't just change how you see someone, it changes how you see yourself. The parts of you that once trusted easily now measure everything twice. The softness you carried begins to harden. It's just enough to protect what's left. By evening, I heard the faint sound of the elevator dinging down the hall. My body stilled, instinct sharp. I glanced at the clock. 6:45. He always said his meetings ran late. I stood by the table, composed, almost detached, as footsteps approached. The sound stopped outside the door. A pause. The metallic slide of a keycard. I didn't hide. The door opened. He froze. The shock on his face wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, almost disbelieving. Like he couldn't reconcile the image of me with the world he'd built around his deceit. "Surprise," I said softly. My voice didn't shake. He opened his mouth, maybe to explain, maybe to lie, but I raised a hand before he could. "Don't," I said. "Not here. Not in this room." The silence that followed was heavy enough to feel solid. He looked at the champagne, at the note, then at me, realization settling like ash. His face shifted through a dozen emotions, but none of them were love. Guilt, maybe, fear, embarrassment, but not love. I picked up the keycard from the table and set it down in front of him. "I found it," I said. "I thought I should return it." For a moment, he looked small, not the man I'd loved, but a stranger caught in his own collapse. I walked past him toward the door, my heels echoing against the floor. I didn't slam it. I didn't cry. I just left it open behind me, because some endings don't need closure. They just need distance. Hook. Sometimes, walking away is the loudest thing you can do. I drove home slowly. City lights blurring into streaks across the windshield. My hands were steady on the wheel. My heart strangely quiet. I thought about how easy it is to mistake routine for love. How blind trust can become a habit when I reached home. The house felt unfamiliar, like a stage set after the actors have gone. Everything was in its place, yet nothing belonged anymore. I sat by the window, watching the night stretch on. No tears came. Just a deep, aching calm. The kind that comes after a long storm when the air finally clears. For the first time in years. I didn't wait for him to come home. I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't rehearse forgiveness instead. I sat with the truth, raw, simple, undeniable. He had built another world and I had found it. Now it was time to build mine. That night, I didn't sleep. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that echoes. Every sound felt amplified. The ticking clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the wind brushing against the windows. It was strange how, even in betrayal, life didn't pause. Everything kept moving, except me. He didn't come home until after midnight. I heard the car pull into the driveway, the engine cutting off, then the slow creak of the front door opening. I stayed in bed, facing the wall, breathing evenly, pretending to sleep. He stood there for a moment, maybe thinking I didn't know, maybe knowing that I did. I heard him set his things down, remove his shoes quietly, and slip into the bathroom. Then, finally, into bed beside me, the mattress dipped under his weight. The scent of perfume, her perfume, faint but undeniable, reached me. He lay still, pretending to sleep too. The space between us was only a few inches wide, yet it felt like miles. That was the first night I truly understood what it meant to be alone beside someone. Hook. Betrayal doesn't begin with lies, it begins with distance. Morning came and I moved through the motions as usual. Coffee, breakfast, a quiet kitchen filled with unsaid things. He tried to act normal. I let him. There's a kind of power in silence, one he couldn't quite read. He said something about work, about needing to leave early. I nodded, pretending not to care. When the door closed behind him, I exhaled for the first time in hours. I walked through the house, every picture, every corner, every echo of the life we'd built. They all felt like memories from someone else's story. I wondered how many of them were real, how many smiles were genuine, how many moments were rehearsed. I tried to remember when the distance had started. Maybe it wasn't sudden. Maybe it had been growing like ivy slowly, quietly, wrapping around everything until it strangled the life out of us. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at my hands. They looked the same, steady, familiar, but they no longer felt like mine. I thought of all the years I'd spent trying to be understanding, supportive, patient. How many times I'd mistaken his detachment for stress, his coldness for exhaustion. I'd carried our love like something sacred. Well, he'd treated it like an accessory he could remove whenever convenient, and yet I didn't hate him. Not yet. Hate is simple, clean, decisive. What I felt was murkier, confusion, tangled with disbelief, pain tied to memory. I still remember the boy he used to be. The one who'd held my hand through every hardship, who'd promised me a life built on honesty. I realized, painfully, that I was grieving not the man beside me, but the version of him that no longer existed. Hook, sometimes what you miss most is the lie that once made you feel safe. I spent the next few days in a haze. He acted as though nothing had happened, maybe convinced I hadn't discovered his secret. He kissed my cheek in the mornings, texted me during lunch, and smiled at dinner. The routine continued hollow, rehearsed. But now I watched him closely. Every gesture, every glance, every casual word. It was like studying a stranger wearing a familiar face. I started noticing things I'd ignored before. The way he kept his phone face down, the extra cologne, the new shirts he hadn't mentioned buying. I realized he wasn't just lying, he was comfortable lying. That was the part that cut deepest. At night, I lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying moments in my head. Our anniversary dinners, vacations, late night talks about the future. Were any of them real? Or had he been performing even then, using my love as a shield to protect his deceit? It's remarkable how quickly trust can unravel. One thread pulled, and suddenly the whole fabric collapses. I began keeping a notebook, not for evidence, but for sanity. I wrote everything I felt, every observation, every emotion I couldn't say out loud. It became my refuge, a place where truth could exist without fear. I wrote about the way my heart still reached for him out of habit, about how my body still turned toward his warmth and sleep, even when my mind screamed no. I wrote about how betrayal doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It seeps in through quiet evenings, through smiles that no longer reach the eyes. Hook. Love doesn't disappear overnight. It decays in silence. One evening while he was working late, I sat in our living room with the lights dimmed. The television played something mindless in the background, but I wasn't watching. I thought about going to that hotel again, about confronting him there, forcing the truth into the light. But a different thought stopped me. What would it change? He'd lie. He'd twist the story. He'd apologize, maybe cry, maybe promise. And I'd still be left with the same hollow ache. So instead, I decided to wait. Not for him, for myself. For the version of me that was ready to let go. Days passed, each one peeling away a layer of denial. I started remembering small details, times he'd been unreachable. Moments when he'd seemed distracted, excuses that hadn't quite added up. They all aligned now, forming a truth I could no longer unsee. And then one morning, while folding laundry, I found another clue. A hotel receipt tucked into his pants pocket. Same place. Different date. A week before the key. It wasn't just one mistake. It was a pattern. I sat on the bed, the paper trembling in my hands, and felt the sharp sting of finality. Whatever love we'd had was gone. What remained was a shell built from habit and pretense. But underneath the pain, a strange calm began to grow. I realized that the worst had already happened. I'd seen the truth, survived it, and was still standing. The betrayal had stripped everything away, but it had also left me bare, unhidden, honest with myself for the first time in years. Hook. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to find yourself again. That evening, he came home as usual, smiling, tired, ordinary. I watched him move around the kitchen, pour a drink, loosen his tie. It was almost poetic, the performance of normalcy against the backdrop of his lies. He looked at me and asked, "Rough day?" I smiled faintly. "Just long." He nodded, oblivious. He didn't notice the way I studied him, memorizing the details of his face, not out of love, but out of farewell. Later that night, after he fell asleep, I stood by the window, watching the reflection of his sleeping form in the glass. I didn't feel rage anymore, only clarity, the kind that comes when the illusion finally breaks. I understood then that the pain wasn't punishment. It was permission. Permission to leave the version of myself that had settled for less. Permission to stop waiting for someone who'd already left me long ago. The next morning, I woke before dawn. The sky was pale gray, the air still. I poured myself coffee, sat on the porch, and watched the world wake up. The quiet felt different now, not empty, but open. I thought about how many times I'd feared this moment, the idea of life without him. Yet sitting there, wrapped in early light, I felt something unexpected peace. A fragile, tentative peace, but real nonetheless. Hook healing doesn't begin when the pain ends. It begins when you stop waiting for it to. When he finally came downstairs, adjusting his tie, ready for another day of lies, I didn't flinch. I handed him his coffee, smiled, and watched him leave. But this time, I didn't wait for the sound of his car to fade. I didn't linger in the doorway, holding on to habit. Instead, I went upstairs, opened the closet, and began packing. Not everything, just enough. A suitcase for me, not for us. I folded my clothes carefully, one by one, as sunlight poured into the room. Each movement felt deliberate cleansing. There was no rush, no chaos, just quiet certainty. By the time he returned that night, I would be gone, not out of revenge, not even out of anger, but because I finally understood that staying wasn't love, it was fear. And fear no longer had a place in my home or in my heart. I zipped the suitcase closed and looked around the room one last time. The photographs, the souvenirs, the shared life that no longer fit. It all felt like an echo fading into the distance. Then I whispered, barely audible, goodbye. Not to him. To the version of myself who thought love meant endurance. I didn't leave that morning, not immediately. Something in me needed to see it through, not for closure, but for confirmation. I didn't want to walk away still wondering if I'd overreacted, if my mind had invented shadows where there were none. I wanted the truth, unfiltered and undeniable, so I stayed one more day. He had another conference that weekend. I knew what that meant now. I told him I might visit my sister, even smiled as I said it. He didn't question me. That was his mistake. As soon as he left, I followed. Not immediately, I waited half an hour. Just enough time for his car to blend into city traffic. Then I took my keys, my notebook, and that strange calm that had replaced my fear. The drive to the Mirabelle Suites felt eerily familiar. Same turns, same skyline, same pit in my stomach. Only this time, I wasn't the one being deceived. I was the one watching. Hook betrayal looks different when you're the one holding the mirror. When I arrived, his car was already there, parked discreetly in the back as if shame preferred shadows. I sat in my car for a moment, watching the revolving doors, waiting for him to appear. And then he did, confident, composed. Carrying that same briefcase that had once symbolized ambition, but now felt like a weapon of deceit. He wasn't alone. She arrived minutes later, younger, beautiful in a way that stung. Not because of envy, but because of recognition. She looked at him the way I once did, as though he was her entire world. The difference was, I now knew what kind of world it truly was. They walked in together, his hand gently resting on her back. Familiar intimacy. Practiced. I waited until they disappeared inside, then stepped out of my car. The air was cool, the kind that carries both clarity and finality. I walked through those same glass doors and approached the front desk with the same measured calm I'd used before. The receptionist didn't recognize me, which was almost poetic. She smiled politely and asked if I needed assistance. "Yes," I said softly. "I'm here to deliver something to Mr. Hale. He's in suite 412. She nodded, checked her screen, and picked up the phone. After a brief call, she said, "He's checked in. I can let you leave it in the room if you'd like." "It's perfect," I said. Moments later, I was standing outside the familiar door again. That same lock. That same silence humming through the hallway. Only now, I wasn't trembling. I was steady. I slid the keycard in. The green light blinked. The door opened. The room was alive with the illusion of romance. Candles half lit. Champagne sweating on the table, his jacket draped over a chair. The faint sound of laughter drifted from the bathroom. Her laughter, bright and unguarded. I didn't move right away. I took in the details, the hotel robe on the bed, the scent of roses. The faint trace of his cologne mixing with something floral. It was strange how betrayal could have a fragrance. Then I saw at his briefcase, unzipped papers spilling out in careless disorder. On top of them, a familiar folder, one from my father's company. For a moment, confusion blurred with disbelief. I reached for it, my fingers brushing the embossed logo, the name I'd grown up around, the legacy my father had built. The folder was filled with acquisition documents, proposals, and contracts, all bearing Daniel's signature. And hers, her name printed neatly beside his dot. It hit me then, the betrayal wasn't just personal. It was calculated. This wasn't about love at all. It was about business, about access, about using me, my family, as a stepping stone. The air left my lungs. My vision narrowed to that single sheet of paper. 25 years of marriage, trust, and devotion, all reduced to a transaction. Hook. Sometimes the knife in your back has your own name carved on it. I sat down, the folder still open in my lap. My heartbeat slowed, not from calm, but from the clarity that comes when pain outgrows surprise. I'd thought his affair was the final betrayal, but this was something deeper. It meant our entire story had been built on a lie. That he'd never loved me. Not really. He'd loved proximity, power, the illusion of a perfect life wrapped around opportunity. Behind the bathroom door, their voices continued, muffled, careless, intimate. She said something that made him laugh. The sound struck me like a ghost from another time. Once that laughter belonged to us. I closed the folder carefully, placed it back where I found it, and stood. My hands didn't shake. My eyes were dry. There's a moment after devastation where emotion stops mattering when you're too broken to feel, too awake to cry. I looked around the room one last time. The champagne, the perfume, the candles, all props in a theater of deception. I could have confronted them right there, screamed, shattered the illusion, forced them into guilt. But that would have given them power. It would have made me part of their story again, instead. Talk silence. I took a small envelope from my purse, one I'd prepared days earlier, though I hadn't known exactly when I'd use it. Inside was a single note, handwritten dot. It read, "You took everything you wanted. I hope it was worth losing everything you had." I placed it neatly on the pillow, beside the champagne flutes. Then I took out my phone and snapped a single picture of the folder, the proof. The signatures, the evidence of his double betrayal. I sent it to my attorney, then to my father, without a caption. The truth would speak for itself. I turned toward the door just as I heard the bathroom handle click. I didn't look back when I stepped into the hallway. The sound of laughter faded behind me, replaced by the muted hum of air vents and the steady rhythm of my own footsteps. The elevator doors opened as if on cue, and I stepped inside. The doors closed, sealing the past behind me. For the first time in years, I felt free. Hook, closure isn't confrontation. It's choosing peace over proof. Driving home, the sky hung low and gray. It's the kind that presses against the horizon like a held breath. I didn't feel triumphant, only emptied. But in that emptiness, there was room to breathe again. When I reached home, I didn't pack this time. I'd already done that. The suitcase was still by the door, waiting. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the window, at the faint reflection of myself. I looked older than I remembered. But there was strength in that reflection too, quiet, earned, unshakable. I thought about the moment we'd first met college hallways, laughter, promise. I thought about how love can blind us, not because we're foolish, because we want to believe so badly that someone sees us the way we see them. And I thought about how easily people can mistake devotion for weakness, not realizing that quiet people are the most dangerous when they finally decide to stop forgiving. Hours passed. The light changed from gold to silver to blue. When I heard the familiar sound of his car pulling into the driveway, I didn't move. He walked in, humming under his breath, setting his briefcase down like nothing had changed. He called my name once, twice, no answer. He walked further in the living room, empty. The kitchen still. The silence growing louder with every step. Then he saw the envelope on the table. His name is written on the front. Inside, the same note I'd left in that hotel room. His expression, I'll never know. I didn't stay to see it because by the time he opened it, I was already gone. That night, I checked into a different hotel. Not to hide, but to rest. The bed was cold, but the air felt clean. I opened the window and let the night breeze fill the room. Below, the city pulsed with life, cars, laughter, movement. I realized that the world doesn't end when someone betrays you. It only gets quieter for a while, till you're ready to hear it again. I lay back against the pillow, exhaustion finally sinking in. My phone buzzed once. A message from my father. I saw the documents. I'm proud of you. For the first time in a long time, I smiled. Not because everything was fine, but because I finally understood that fine wasn't the goal. Freedom was. Hook, sometimes strength isn't in fighting back. It's in walking away before the fire touches you. Outside, dawn began to stretch across the horizon. Soft, slow, patient. I closed my eyes and let it wash over me. Tomorrow, I'd start over. But tonight, I allowed myself the luxury of stillness. And in that stillness, for the first time in years, I felt alive. When the door closed behind him that night, it wasn't just the sound of departure. It was the quiet collapse of everything that had once held me steady. The hotel room felt colder after he left. Not because of the air, but because of the silence he left behind. It wasn't triumphant silence. It was the kind that echoed, the kind that asked what all of this had ever really meant. For hours, I sat in that room with the city glowing beneath the window, my hands resting in my lap, my pulse slowly evening out. I could still smell his cologne on the chair he'd brushed against. Faint and expensive, the same one that used to make me close my eyes and breathe him in. Now, it made my stomach twist. There was no satisfaction in what I'd done, only the hollow understanding that the truth, once set free, can't ever be returned to silence. In the days that followed, everything looked the same but felt entirely different. Morning light still spilled across our kitchen counter, soft and golden, but it touched everything with unfamiliar distance. The house was quieter too, not because he'd moved out yet, but because words had stopped living here. We went about our routines like strangers sharing borrowed space. I'd hear his footsteps across the hardwood floors, his briefcase snapping shut, his voice on the phone pretending the world was still in order. I didn't interrupt that illusion. I let him believe control was still his. It was easier that way to watch from the quiet edges, to learn what silence can do when you let it speak for you. Some mornings, I'd see him glance at me across the table, searching for traces of the woman who used to love him openly. He didn't realize she was gone. She'd left the moment she opened that coat pocket and found the keys. What sat across from him now was something colder, quieter, infinitely stronger. When he finally packed his things, he did it without words. No apologies, no explanations. Just the soft rustle of fabric and the dull click of the suitcase clasp. I watched from the hallway, not because I wanted to stop him, but because I wanted to remember the sight. The man who once promised forever, now reduced to someone folding his life into a suitcase. He didn't look back, and I didn't ask him to. After he left, I expected grief to rush in and fill the space he'd occupied. But instead, it was stillness. Heavy, almost sacred stillness. I wandered through the house, touching the walls, the chairs, the framed photos we once thought meant something. Everything was both familiar and foreign, like walking through a museum of a life that wasn't mine anymore. Nights were the hardest. The bed felt enormous, the air too loud. Sleep came in fragments, bursts of exhaustion interrupted by flashes of memory. His laughter, the way his hand used to rest at the small of my back, the ring he'd slipped on my finger years ago, which now sat on the nightstand. Cold and silent. I thought I'd feel hatred, but hatred requires energy, and I had none left. What I felt instead was detachment, a clean, quiet absence, like the world had shifted slightly. And I was standing in a place where pain couldn't quite reach me anymore. Weeks passed before the whispers reached me. Colleagues of his, old friends, even his assistant, they spoke with cautious sympathy. The affair, it turned out, had been more than a brief lapse. There had been others before her. Quiet arrangements, business trips that weren't my silence after the hotel exposed more than I ever intended. The facade he'd built, the pristine image he wore so carefully, began to crumble under its own weight. I didn't need to interfere. I didn't need to destroy him. Truth has a way of unraveling on its own. And it did, quietly. Mercilessly. His downfall came in pieces. One client pulled out. A rumor about inappropriate conduct found its way into an article. Investors grew cautious. In the background of it all, my father's name, the one he'd once used to climb, started to drift away from his own. The separation was slow, inevitable, and almost poetic. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of him in the news. A blurred photograph leaving an office building, its expression tight and drawn. Each image felt like closure I hadn't asked for. I didn't celebrate his loss. I simply observed it. He was fading, and I was finally learning how to exist without the gravity of him. But it wasn't easy. Healing rarely is. Some mornings, the ache would still return. Not for him, but for the version of myself who had believed so completely. I missed her. Her faith. Her softness. I wanted to reach back through time and tell her that love isn't supposed to cost this much of yourself. That silence isn't peace when it hides the truth. Slowly, I began rebuilding in small ways. Rearranging furniture, changing the curtains, cooking meals for one, and lighting candles anyway. There was something sacred about reclaiming the mundane, about reminding myself that life still existed in these spaces. There were moments of relapse. Too, like seeing his handwriting on old notes or hearing a song that once belonged to us. Those moments didn't break me anymore. They only reminded me that pain, when held long enough, eventually turns into understanding. One afternoon, months later, I found the hotel key again. It had been tucked away in the drawer, forgotten under papers. I held it in my hand, its weight strangely comforting. It wasn't a symbol of betrayal anymore. It was a reminder of the day I chose truth over illusion. The day I stopped being someone's mirror and became my own reflection again. I didn't throw it away. I kept it quietly. It's proof that even endings can have meaning. When people ask me now if I ever regret what I did, I don't have an easy answer. I don't think closure ever comes cleanly wrapped. It arrives in fragments, in mornings that don't hurt. In nights where silence feels like safety instead of punishment. I never wanted to ruin him. I just wanted to stop pretending. And maybe that's what real strength looks like, not vengeance. But released by the time spring came, the house no longer felt haunted. I began to open the windows again. The light fell differently now, warmer, clearer. I caught my reflection in the glass one morning and realized I didn't look broken anymore. Just changed. He became a memory. I became something new, and that was enough. Healing didn't happen all at once. It came in quiet, uneven waves, moments that felt too small to notice until they began to stitch themselves together into something whole. For a long time, I moved through life like I was learning how to breathe again. Each breath was deliberate, sometimes heavy, sometimes easy. But it was mine. There was no single morning when I woke up and realized I was healed. It was more like a slow unfolding. I'd find myself smiling at something small. The smell of coffee, the sound of rain, the soft creak of the wooden stairs. Life began to return in pieces, gentle and familiar. Like an old song I'd forgotten the words to, but still knew the melody. I started walking every evening. It became my ritual to move through the city, past the places we once visited, past the corners that used to hold our laughter. At first, it hurt. Every step was a confrontation with memory. But over time, the ache dulled, and the streets stopped feeling haunted. They became mine again. I began to see beauty in things I'd overlooked for years. The color of the sky before sunset, the rhythm of footsteps on wet pavement, the small kindness of strangers. Grief had turned me inward, but healing taught me to look outward again. I started noticing the world not as something that had betrayed me, but as something that was quietly waiting for me to return. For months, I avoided mirrors. I couldn't bear to look at the face that had believed so deeply in a lie. But one morning, while brushing my hair, I caught my reflection, and for the first time, I didn't see the woman who had been left behind. I saw someone different. Someone is still carrying scars, but standing taller because of them. I realized then that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's found in silence, in the decision to keep going when no one's watching. To choose peace over bitterness, I stopped keeping track of time after that. Days blurred softly into one another. I filled them with things that made me feel alive again. Long drives, old books, music that didn't hurt anymore. I stopped replaying the betrayal in my head, stopped needing to understand why he did what he did. Some truths lose their power the moment you stop feeding them. The hotel where it all happened changed. Management a few months later. I read it in the local news almost by accident. New owners, new decor, new name. I imagined the room, the one where I had once waited for him, repainted, rebranded, stripped of its ghosts. There was something comforting about that. The world had quietly moved on. And so had I. Sometimes I think healing is just learning how to stop living inside the moment that broke you. For so long, I'd been orbiting around that night, replaying the keys, the waiting, the reveal. But healing meant turning my orbit inward, reclaiming my gravity. One night, I returned to the ocean. It had been years since I'd stood there, the same beach where we'd once walked barefoot in the early years of our marriage. The air was cold, the wind sharp. I stood at the edge of the water and let the waves rush over my feet. The sea didn't care about my pain, my story, or his betrayal. It moved endlessly, indifferent and alive. And somehow that was comforting. I took the hotel key from my pocket, the one I had kept. The metal was smooth from being held too often, a small relic of a life I no longer belonged to. For a moment, I just looked at it. Then, without ceremony, I let it fall into the surf. It sank quickly, swallowed by the water. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just stood there feeling the tide pull against my skin and realized that letting go isn't a dramatic act, it's a quiet decision to stop carrying what isn't yours anymore. When I walked back to the car, I felt lighter. Not free, freedom is too big a word, but lighter. Like something had finally shifted. In the following weeks, I started writing again. Nothing elaborate, just pieces of thought, fragments of memory. At first it was for myself, small reflections that made sense of what I'd lived through. But the more I wrote, the more I realized I wasn't writing about him. I was writing about survival, about rediscovering who I was before love became a mirror for someone else's ambition. There's a strange kind of peace, in knowing you've already survived your worst day. It changes how you move through the world. Fear loses its shape. You begin to trust your own strength more than you trust the promises of others. Seasons shifted quietly around me. Trees bloomed, shed, bloomed again. Time no longer felt like something I was trying to outrun. I was finally living inside it again. One afternoon, I sat in a cafe I used to visit in my 20s. I watched couples laugh, old friends talk, people hurrying by with the urgency of their own lives. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like an outsider looking in. I was part of the noise again. It's part of the motion. That's when I understood that healing isn't about forgetting. It's about remembering without bleeding. It's about reclaiming every version of yourself that you lost along the way. I sometimes think about how easily we mistake love for safety, how we build our homes in other people, never realizing that real safety begins inside ourselves. He was a chapter, a painful, necessary one, but not the whole story. The rest, the part that belongs entirely to me, is still being written now. When I pass by hotels, I don't think of betrayal. I think of beginnings, of how endings, no matter how brutal, can be the soil for something new. Healing didn't come with grand gestures. It came with small choices to get out of bed, to eat, to breathe, to walk, to trust again. It came with learning that forgiveness doesn't always mean absolution. Sometimes it simply means refusing to let bitterness own you. I no longer need closure. What happened will always be a part of my story, but it no longer defines it. The woman I am now doesn't seek explanations. She seeks peace and finds it more often than not, in the quiet moments between heartbeats. And maybe that's the most powerful transformation of all, when the silence that once hurt becomes the silence that heals. A year later, my life feels like a room that's finally been aired out, the kind where light drifts through the curtains in soft, forgiving ways. The air is different now, cleaner, quieter. There's still an echo of what was, but it doesn't haunt me anymore. It just exists, like an old photograph you don't need to hide. But no longer feel the urge to frame. I moved into a smaller apartment by the water. It isn't grand, but it's mine in a way that nothing ever was before. Every corner holds the evidence of my own choosing the color of the walls, the plants that lean toward the sunlight, the books stacked unevenly on the nightstand. For the first time in my life, I live surrounded only by things that make sense to me. There's a kind of quiet freedom in that. Mornings have become sacred. I wake early, before the city stirs, and sit by the window with my coffee. The world outside is still half asleep, the sky a pale shade of blue. I've come to love that hour, that fragile line between night and day where everything feels possible. It's where peace lives now. In those unremarkable moments no one sees. Sometimes I wonder who I might have been if none of it had happened, if love hadn't betrayed me, if trust hadn't cracked. But then I realize I wouldn't trade the woman I've become for the woman I used to be. She loved deeply, yes, but she also ignored her own intuition, silenced her unease, and gave too much of herself to someone who saw her only as a means to an end. The woman I am now doesn't do that anymore. There are traces of him, still memories that drift through at random. The sound of his voice in a crowd. The smell of his cologne on a passing stranger. They used to sting. Now they're just reminders of how far I've come. Proof that something once powerful has finally lost its hold. I never saw him again after the divorce papers were signed. The last time I heard his name was through a colleague who mentioned he'd moved to another city, started over. I didn't ask for details. His life doesn't concern me anymore. Some stories don't deserve sequels. Instead, I've been writing. Quietly, consistently. It started as therapy, but it became something else. A way to map the terrain of my own heart. To understand what love and loss had really taught me. My journal is filled with fragments. Half-finished thoughts, images, memories, and truths that once scared me to say aloud. I write not to remember him, but to remember myself. There's a rhythm to healing. It doesn't move forward in a straight line, but in circles that slowly widen until the pain no longer sits at the center. Some days I still feel the ache of what was lost, but it no longer defines the day. It's just a faint hum beneath the surface. A reminder that even broken hearts keep beating. People sometimes tell me I seem stronger now. I don't correct them, but the truth is, strength isn't what I feel. It's more like stillness, the kind that comes after a long storm when everything finally settles. You stop fighting the wind, stop fearing the dark. You just exist, and somehow that's enough. There are nights when still lie awake and think about the smallness of it all, how one moment can change everything, how a set of keys could rewrite the entire course of a life. But then I remind myself that endings are also beginnings. What he broke, I rebuilt. What he used, I reclaimed. Sometimes when I walk along the water, I think of the version of me who once stood there, holding that key before letting it go. I wish I could tell her that she was right to do it, that she didn't destroy her life that night. She saved it. The ocean never returned the key, but it gave me something better, perspective. It taught me that the tide always comes back, but never brings the same water twice. That's what healing is, I think. Not erasing what happened, but becoming new again in the same place. I've learned to love quietly now. Not someone else, not yet, but life itself. The way light spills across the floor in the morning. The way laughter feels when it isn't forced. The way silence no longer frightens me. There's power in solitude, not because it shields you from pain, but because it teaches you how to survive it. If you had told me then that I would find peace after everything, that I would learn to breathe without the weight of him, I wouldn't have believed you. But here I am, breathing, living, whole in a way never was before. Sometimes the greatest revenge is simply happiness that doesn't need to be witnessed. Now, when I close my eyes, I don't see the hotel room or the betrayal or the lies. I see the horizon endless, unbothered, alive. I see myself standing at the edge of it, not waiting for anyone this time. Just watching the world unfold and knowing I belong to it again. And maybe that's how it always ends. Not with grand closure, not with a final confrontation, but with a quiet moment of peace when you realize the pain no longer defines you. The story began with keys and secrets, but it ends here with silence, sunlight, and a woman who finally learned that love doesn't need to be proven, only felt. They say betrayal breaks you, right? But I've learned it doesn't. It just strips away everything that wasn't real. Until all that's left is the truth, raw, painful, and unmistakable. And from that truth, you begin again. For me, it wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming the parts of myself I had forgotten while trying to be loved by someone who never truly saw me. The world tells us that heartbreak is weakness, but it's not. It's proof that we dared to love in a world that rewards indifference. There's a kind of grace that comes with loss, not the immediate kind that comforts, but the slow kind that rebuilds. The kind that teaches you the sound of your own heart when it's no longer echoing someone else's lies. I used to believe that love was something you gave completely, without limits. Now I understand that real love, even the love we offer others, must begin within ourselves. Because when you forget who you are for someone else, you hand them the power to destroy you. The truth is, betrayal will happen. Maybe not in the same way, maybe not with the same scars. But life has a way of testing what we think is unbreakable. And when it does, you'll learn that the pain doesn't last forever. It burns, yes. It tears through everything you thought was certain. But then it leaves space. Space for clarity, for courage, for something honest. If you're watching this and you're living through your own unraveling, if you've found the evidence, seen the truth, or felt the shift you can't explain, don't rush to fix it. Let it break. Let it hurt. Because only when it's all gone can you see what was worth saving. And when you finally walk away, whether it's from a person, a lie, or a version of yourself that can't survive anymore, do it quietly. You don't owe the world your rage. Sometimes the loudest act of strength is silence. In the end, healing isn't about forgetting them. It's about remembering you. The woman who walked into that hotel room wasn't the same one who walked out. And maybe that's what all endings really are. A beginning disguised as heartbreak. Sometimes, the people who break us are the very ones who force us to meet ourselves for the first time. So tell me, have you ever found out a truth that changed everything? Would you have done what I did? Share your thoughts below and subscribe for more stories like this one. Because some stories aren't just about betrayal. They're about what it takes to come back from it.